All right, welcome everyone. This is the Cybersecurity Grand Challenge breakout session. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have several more people join as as people switch over from the main session. So welcome everyone. I'm Jeremy Lawrence. I'm a principal technical leader at EPRI. I work in EPRI's Generation for Cybersecurity program. So I'm really excited to be leading this Grand Challenge session today. And really not just today, but really the community of interest as we go forward, working together to try to solve cybersecurity challenges leveraging artificial intelligence. So I did want to go over a few housekeeping items before we go ahead and get going. We are using WebEx a little bit different from the main sessions that we've had so far, but feel free to ask questions throughout this. So we've got a couple different ways to ask questions. So one way to do it is ask a verbal question. You can do that by raising your hand and we'll go ahead and take you off mute. You can raise your hand if you go over to the participants. If you don't see the participants list, you can go over and click on a little button down at the right-hand corner of your screen, and that should pop up or show the participants. And then next to your name, you'll see a little hand icon, and that'll notify the presenters that you have a question. The other thing you can do is definitely drop any questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those throughout the presentations today. And we'll also have a chance to answer questions at the end as well. The other thing that is not on this slide, but I'm a big fan of, is we've got the emojis feature on WebEx. And so that's a good way to add a little bit of a reaction. So if somebody says something that you like, go ahead and drop a thumbs up, clap your hands, celebrate. Really just let folks know that you're listening and enjoying what they're talking about as well. So feel free to use that throughout. It's fun, adds a little bit of interaction as well. All right, so we'll get right into this. And so we've got about almost 2 hours to talk today, and we've got a great lineup of presenters here. And we'll get into this in a little bit, just what we're going to be covering today. But really, when we look at cybersecurity, we look at things like the cybersecurity changing threat landscape. We look at emerging technologies and other drivers. And one of the things that when we started thinking about this overall grand challenge that I think really was interesting was just how cybersecurity is constantly changing, especially in the energy industry. So we all know that our energy systems are run by OT or operational technology. Sometimes we talk about it as industrial control systems as well. And those control systems control things like our gas turbines, solar inverter technologies, protective relays, and everything in between. And these really present several unique challenges. So a lot of times when we look at OT as opposed to IT, we're looking at very purpose-built components, things that don't have the same capabilities that our IT infrastructure typically have from a cybersecurity perspective. We also deal with a lot of legacy types of devices. A lot of the things, the way that they're configured using proprietary protocols really limit some of the capabilities and the technologies that we could deploy similar to industrial control or similar to IT cybersecurity approaches as well. So several months ago, you probably heard Jeremy Renshaw mention in the main session, we had a reverse pitch. So really what this reverse pitch was we had industry representatives talk about challenges associated with respective areas, and then we had industry stakeholders that had AI domain expertise talk about ways that those could be leveraged to help solve some of those challenges. And so with that, we did identify cybersecurity as one of the areas that had a great potential for leveraging AI-based approaches to enhance our overall cybersecurity posture. So when we look at cybersecurity, this grand challenge and the different focus areas, we actually came up with 3 main pillars that we would focus on. And the first is kind of the obvious one, and that's really focusing on how can we enhance cybersecurity in the energy sector through adoption of AI-based approaches and technologies. So that's kind of the first one. So looking at those different use cases, how we can solve and help fill in some of the cybersecurity gaps using artificial intelligence-based approaches. The second one is really looking at, as artificial intelligence becomes more prevalent, as the use cases become more critical and key for operations and safety in the energy sector, how do we recognize both the increased importance of these different application use cases, but also how do we protect both the data and the data models themselves? Because as we think about cybersecurity, we often think about it from a risk-based perspective, and the idea is that we have to optimize what we do so that we protect things according to their level of risk. And so with that, it becomes really important to understand those different use cases as artificial intelligence becomes more prominent in our day-to-day operations and safety of the power plant. And then last but not least is the third focus area, and this is kind of a counterbalance to the first one, is understanding the changing threat landscape and how attackers could potentially use artificial intelligence to craft their attacks. And we've already started to see this in a few examples, looking at leveraging things like using artificial intelligence for development of deep fakes and artificial intelligence enhancements to generate more mature phishing campaigns as well. And this is really important. So I think this is really just a first step and just something we need to be aware of as cybersecurity practitioners and experts across the industry, because those couple of examples are examples of social engineering based attacks. And social engineering is something that definitely is prevalent across the board in cybersecurity and is of extreme importance as well. And so really what we want to do is kind of center around these three different main focus areas, and then through this grand challenge interest group, facilitate enhanced cybersecurity application through identifying new use cases, sharing data, advanced demonstrations, and also sharing key insights as well. So we have a great lineup of presenters. They're going to talk about a wide range of different things associated with cybersecurity and artificial intelligence use cases today. So we've got a great lineup. We're going to hear from Liz Holland from Duke Energy. Liz leads the Duke Energy Regulated Renewables Generation Cybersecurity Program at Duke Energy, and she's going to share some perspectives on the some of the cybersecurity needs and challenges that the industry is facing. I think that'll help provide a good background and level set as we start thinking about that first pillar on how we can deploy AI-based use cases to help solve some of these challenges. Then we'll hear from Neil Forrest and Andres Sasbo from Pivigo, and they're going to talk about the importance of people in protecting data, as well as some of those critical AI use cases, and really provide a perspective of some of the wide range of AI-based deployments that they've seen, not just in the energy industry, but other industries, and really provide a good perspective of the importance and the increased criticality of some of these deployments. Then we'll also hear from Ryan King and Richard Macklin from the Department of Energy National Renewable Energy Laboratory, talking about using AI for cybersecurity in the energy industry, and give a great perspective from NREL and some of the cool projects that they're looking at, and some of the potential use cases. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Aiden Livingston from Thermo AI. And Aiden's going to give a really good perspective of some technology that they've deployed for anomaly detection using external sensors. First looking at it from an anomaly detection standpoint for operations, but also some of the potential cybersecurity applications as well. So with that, I'm going to switch it over. I'm going to hand it over to Liz to talk about industry needs and challenges. So Liz, I'm going to drag the ball over to you.
All right.
Maybe.
It looks like I got it.
All right. Take it away, Liz.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeremy. As Jeremy said, my name's Liz Holland, and I'm the manager for Generation Cybersecurity at Duke Energy in our regulated renewable energy group. So that's most of our generation sources. It doesn't include some of our non-regulated generation, and it also does not include our nuclear generation. Um, so my role here today is to talk to you a little bit about industry perspective. So I just really have one slide, but several things to talk about through here. So probably the first thing you should do whenever you want to build a cybersecurity program is understand what you're protecting. Unfortunately, in generation and other electric environments, that is a very big challenge. Understanding your asset inventory is really difficult when you have systems where you prioritize the availability of the equipment. So in a traditional IT system, you would prioritize confidentiality and integrity over availability of your equipment. So you can, you call your help desk and you reboot your computer every time there's something funny about it. It's no big deal. But when we're talking about operating and delivering electricity to our customers, we don't want to reboot the equipment, right? We don't want to shut the plant down. So we don't want to do things like actively request data, actively ping or search out information about the assets. So at this time, there's not a really viable solution to do a good complete inventory for our equipment. So our really only option is to go do walkdowns, and at best, that's humans out walking it down. And how often can you do that? So it's not real-time data; it's a snapshot in time, and it's subject to human error. A lot of our equipment is not in the world's most favorable places, so it's not necessarily the fault of the people doing the walkdowns. It's just not a place you really want to hang out for a long time. But as part of that asset inventory, we really feel like there are some other pieces that need to be included. Things like asset lifecycle, and that can be not only the components lifecycle, but also maybe the facilities lifecycle. So as you all may or may not be aware, we're all working through a lot of transition in the energy industry. We're trying to move to less carbon generation, looking at different fuel sources. And so that's really affecting everybody's view on the energy portfolio. And how long is that plant going to run? And are we going to make transitions to the fuel types? And so when you're considering asset life cycle, you may be thinking about the whole power plant, and you know that it may not run for very much longer depending on its fuel source if it's a coal plant in an unfavorable environment. And in addition, we have to consider threat and vulnerability management. So, our assets often are more separated from the internet than a traditional IT network, but not necessarily air gapped. And even if they were, there's still the potential for somebody to walk around with a USB or a laptop and plug it in and provide a pathway for something to attack your systems. So you can't completely rely on your architecture as a safety. However, it does play a role, and there are factors that protect you being more isolated, but you still have threats and vulnerabilities that you have to manage and understand, kind of where your equipment stands. Sometimes you have a vulnerability that you aren't going to patch because the vendor says you shouldn't patch it. But other times you have things out there that you don't even know about. And so it needs to be a way to correlate that data about what we know for threats and vulnerabilities with the asset inventory. Um, so so that kind of takes the big picture of asset inventory, but we're still challenged to protect all this equipment without that. So that's one of the big things we feel like we just haven't figured out how to tackle it yet. So that's probably the biggest challenge. The second one we really see is how do we keep data confidential? So we do have data that we shouldn't be sharing, and we have vendors that we collaborate with very heavily. A lot of times the vendor almost knows more about our systems than we do, but we are challenged to support collaboration and projects with our vendors and maintain that confidentiality. So, there are compliance standards, but also just security standards around email, or other data transmittal. Most everything goes through the cloud these days, and I'm sure you all feel kind of the same way. When you can't see something, you're not exactly sure what happens to it and how it's protected. So you're relying on a service provider around cloud security, which is that's a whole other set of vulnerabilities you open yourself up to. So are there ways to share data and support project collaboration while you maintain that data confidentiality? Particularly around AI, around cloud storage and that kind of stuff. And like I mentioned, this is particularly important with regulatory compliance. We're in a space now where it's very difficult to share data other than like verbally over the phone and still meet our compliance requirements in some cases. So it's definitely something that we're struggling with, and we don't have a good answer for how to do that. Next on my list is incident response. So we do some drills and training, but I think you would find, especially in environments where we're talking about generating electricity, transmitting electricity, it's all tabletop. We don't even have good simulation of what it would look like to have a cyber attack. So I know some generating facilities like nuclear do a really good job at simulating different kinds of failures in plants, but even they probably don't have really built out cyber drills. So there's some opportunity there to simulate for the plant operators and the folks working on the equipment what it might look like when someone has breached their system and attacked it. You know, tabletop drills let us practice the steps in our procedures and the phone calls we have to make, but they don't really let us see what the actual impact at the plant or at the generating station or the, you know, in the energy control center would be. So we really see some significant value could be added there with some interactive training. And it would also help. We found that in drills that there are communication challenges. So a lot of times our folks at the plant speak one language and they have to call folks in an IT control center to report that they've had some kind of incident and they need help. And those folks speak kind of a different language. And sometimes those differences can be significant and cause problems. So more training, more opportunities to build those scenarios and work on identifying and fixing those differences would be super helpful. You know, an IT person can use one term and a person at a power plant thinks it means something completely different. And we don't know that until the moment that they say it. And you hear the phrase and say, oh my gosh, I don't think you meant what you said. So we definitely see some opportunities there to increase our ability to react. And then finally, intelligent threat monitoring. So I'm not sure exactly how many utilities are in what stage, but we are installing some monitoring tools at our facilities. And so that's going to collect a lot of data and send it out to a central monitoring group. Concerns there from the OT side of the house are, oh my gosh, they're going to call me all the time. Every single thing that comes up on their screen, they're not going to know what it is, and they're going to call and have a problem. But then the other concern is, do we filter that data down and filter it out so much that we don't see the thing that we need to see, the one event that is the, you know, the smoking gun. So we've got a lot of work to do there around not only how can we collect that data centrally in a format that can be, you know, universal, come from many different components, many different vendors' equipment, and be universally received. But then also, how do we filter that data to a way that's useful and provides alarms and alerts that mean something and aren't just noise? Because the other worry too is you get a lot of noise and you learn to ignore it. And so then why are you even monitoring anything if no one's looking at it? So that kind of goes along as well with the government effort that came out as part of the 100-day cybersecurity effort around ICS. There was some work to send data to a central government repository to look for trending. And so that same kind of filtering and optimizing data collection really will help when you have an even bigger data set and you're trying to look at more information. And it's both more and less information. It's more pieces of information, but it's anonymized, so it's less detail about where it's coming from. So, you know, being able to really identify the things in that data set that are useful is something that we really see as an opportunity as well. So that really sums up the items I had covered for industry needs and challenges, Jeremy. So I'll pass it back to you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Liz. That was excellent, providing that insight and that perspective. Really talking about some of the daily needs and challenges associated with cybersecurity in the energy industry. So we've got a few minutes for questions. Feel free to drop any questions for Liz in the chat box. I think what I found really interesting is the discussion centering around the inventory aspect and just the needs of that, right? And I think it's kind of foundational, and it sounds on the surface maybe basic, but really when you start digging into it, there's just a lot of challenges, especially with OT systems and what we can see and what we can't see. So I think, maybe one of the things I'm thinking about is, Liz, could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the possible sources of data that we do have that might help, that might be able to be utilized for AI-based approaches for inventory?
Sure. So a couple things we do have. So when we do go to sites and patch, we can get reports that come back with information about the equipment that was um, tied into the central tools. So you can get some reports there and you can parse some of that data out. So it gives you some information. We also, I would expect most utilities are this way. We have some information in databases about equipment, but it's typically not to the level that you would need for a complete asset inventory, right? So it doesn't include things like firmware versions or even software patches that have been applied. So that makes it hard when you're trying to do that vulnerability response. A lot of places have done walkdowns, so there's some level of information available there. And then there's limited information that you can get from passive monitoring as well, and we have some of that, but again, it's not complete. The things we really lack are the details down into, has this thing been patched to version XYZ, because that's the one that remediates this vulnerability we know about. So that's really the challenge there. And I'll say, one of the other things we've seen as an example is when we do know about a vulnerability and we say it applies to a certain version of Windows, we can't even get an accurate count typically. We think we have X number of boxes, and then that number goes up and down by 5 or 6 or 7 because sites have done modifications that we don't always know about. So for what we know is it's something that changes rapidly, and because everything's not centrally connected and we can't just run a scan, you don't always know when things have changed since the last time you were there. Does that help, Jeremy?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great, really good perspective, because, that when we look at inventory more on IT systems, there's a lot more interconnectivity. And we do see that to an extent. I mean, in the OT systems, at power plants specifically, a lot of things are connected, but there's a lot of things that either aren't or are behind a serial link that we can't see. And there's also some limitations with respect to deploying agents that we typically use to gather some of that detailed asset information that we need. And so I think that's one area that there might be some potential opportunity, because to your point, there is some data, but really what we're trying to do is take a limited data set and be able to use what we know to potentially fill in some of those gaps. Okay, great. Any questions for Liz? All right. So next, then what I think we'll do then is we'll turn it over to our next presenters. Thank you so much, Liz, and we can still, if anybody has any questions, definitely feel free to drop those into the chat box. But what I'll do now is I'll turn it over to our next presenters. And next, we're going to hear from Pivigo, and we're going to hear from Neil Forrest and Andres Sasbo from Pivigo. And Pivigo is a company that develops AI-based solutions for companies of all sizes across the world. They've also have a very interesting program where they train data scientists. And as part of doing that, they're able to see a very wide breadth of types of AI projects, and over time see more critical applications of AI as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Neil and Andres.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Liz. Just before we start, I just wanted to say we worked with the National Fraud Database in the UK, who were faced with a similar challenge, wanted to assimilate data from many different financial service providers, because you're absolutely right. The strength is in combining data, especially in anomaly detection, especially in fraud detection. So yeah, it's an area we've had experience of firsthand. So thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, my name's Neil Forrest. I am Chief Commercial Officer for Pivigo. Pivigo, as Jeremy introduced us, we as well as delivering data science projects, we train data scientists through our boot camp. And I think it's worth stating that nothing of an AI nature is going to get created without the efforts and the intelligence of data scientists. So that's a key part of our business and our proposition. Next slide, please, Jeremy. So we're an 8-year-old organization. I guess that makes us veterans of the AI space in relative terms. We've worked across pretty much every vertical in industry you care to imagine. We haven't done any work in gaming and defense, but apart from those, from financial services to e-commerce to heavy industry, we've worked on AI, machine learning and deep learning projects for many different companies. Since 2019, we've had an ongoing relationship with EPRI. So we've been, I guess, the data science firepower behind some really interesting and cutting edge AI research projects. Just a quick point about the business. So the boot camp, as we were referred to, we call it science to data science. Andras is going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But it's essentially the opportunity that we saw was to help facilitate the transition for academics into data science. To be a data scientist, I'm sure requires a fairly unusual and rarefied combination of skills in maths, in statistics, in working with large data sets. So, data science, unfortunately, isn't for everyone. And therefore, certainly back in 2013, and probably still to this day, there is a shortage in industry. There's a greater demand for data scientists than there are data scientists. So that was the motivation for founding the business, and it still is a key part of our proposition. Over time, alongside the bootcamp, we have also cultivated some other sort of operating models. We provide an AI as a service. So imagine the SaaS model that you're used to, but for companies for whom sort of the hiring and sort of motivating machine learning engineers and data scientists is probably too much of an ask, that they can use Pivigo as essentially an arm's length AI department for their businesses. Next slide, please. And I think it's Andras.
Yes, that's me. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Andras. I'm a physicist by training, and the first time I came into contact with data science was through Pivigo and joining this program called Science to Data Science. So what this program is offering an opportunity to academics, researchers to give a try at industry, see how their skills fit there. So academics and researchers have amazing skills, as I'm sure you are aware, or at least some of you, that can be really valuable for industry. So these PhD level and postdoctoral researchers coming from quantitative backgrounds are put together to work on some project for a company. They are put together in teams of 5 in a period of 5 weeks, and they are mentored essentially through this program with help from Pivigo and as well from the client company. So Neil has already mentioned EPRI, who we worked with, but some of the other names are highlighted here. Our clients come from all sorts of regions and backgrounds and sectors, as well as sizes. So we have worked with 2-person startups and multinational corporates as well. Over these 8 years, we have run 20 programs with over 250 projects, and all this varied background from the participants' side and the varied backgrounds of our partners as you can imagine, brings a lot of variability of the programs that we have seen, and all sorts of different projects that are possible. And we use these opportunities, these 20 sessions of STDS, to improve the process and give a better and better training introducing academics to this world. And this is a strange world for academics, and I will come back to that. What is it that they really learn, especially in terms of data handling and being aware of being careful about how we handle data. And on the next slides, I would like to talk you through two of these types of data projects that we work with, and I'm using this as an alternative to the power plant data that has been widely discussed here. These are also quite sensitive projects that we have to work with, and we managed to get the students up to scratch with this. So the first type of problem that we are working with is around housing. So in the UK, there is an institution called social housing, or a phenomena of social housing, which is there in place to ensure that everybody has a home, even if they become unable to pay rent for some reason. They are at low income, or often these people are vulnerable for some reason. So these people, when they find themselves in these situations, they can turn to housing associations or local governments called councils who offer a subsidized rent or a favorable access to housing for these people. And a special part of social housing is that tenants are also cannot be evicted, even if they are unable to pay rent. So this is part of the social aspect of this construct. So in this situation, of course, for the housing associations, it is in their best interest to help the tenants pay the rent as much as they can. And the best way to ensure that this happens is to preemptively have a look at them, monitor how they are performing, and see who are the most vulnerable. After the tenants would fall into debt, it is much, much harder to help them out. So it is really key that we have some sort of predictive power in here. And we believe these are the areas where artificial intelligence and machine learning can help. Now, to determine the situation of a tenant, whether or not they are have the potential to fall into debt or fall into arrears, we have to look at their data. And these are quite sensitive data, well, including their payment history over time, how their behavior was previously. The characteristics of the buildings often determine this, but more importantly, the tenant characteristics. And this is, of course, a highly personal data set. So we have run several programs like that, and always the data security is at the forefront of our thinking in these aspects. Thank you, Jeremy. So in the next slide is another interesting use case where we have worked with mental health data. So another important aspect from the societal point of view is mental health in the UK. Cases are on the rise. It might be a global phenomenon. And these cases, when someone finds themselves in this situation, is best helped by mental health practitioners. So mental health practitioners, through appointments, can help the affected people to get through these issues. And this therapy is becoming more and more challenging as COVID came into place, as well as because the cases of the increasing cases of mental health issues is not met by an increase in the number of therapists. So access to therapy is infrequent and limited, and this is a problem because monitoring of these cases becomes less accurate and more reactive rather than proactive. So how can AI help here? One solution to help this is to provide an online platform where users or patients can register and then perform some daily activities. Their activities such as reading texts or reacting to pictures or playing some games. These are recorded as clickstream data or voice recordings or facial video recordings. And by analyzing these recordings, we can infer some metrics that are very informative for the therapist. So essentially, you can turn this platform into an aid for the therapist to almost have an update on a daily basis. So again, very personal data and sensitive as well. So in these situations, what we have to be prepared for is the people, the academics who come into these programs have often dealt with experimental data from, let's say, material sciences or biology that are maybe do not even have any personal data. And they are very used to an open culture of sharing data sets as well as code bases. So in these scenarios, STDS is a very interesting place where learnings can be taken. In the next slide, please, Jeremy. What we try to do, and here is what I collect our learnings, that we teach our participants that they have to use, first of all, centralized code base. So that's something that is very important in order to make sure that all the code that is later on deployed or used for any sort of inferences is accurate. Having this sounds probably very fundamental to most of you, but it is not a widespread thing that people are aware of. So after the code, data, of course, is very important to be secure and shared across the team, so there is no duplication unnecessarily, and this also avoids data corruption. So with less sensitive data and looser restrictions on the data, Dropbox and Google Drive is actually some of these services that are very useful because people are used to them, and they allow you to set some provider set access defaults. But often there is a lot to miss. There's a lot lacking in these systems. And so we went further and we use AWS's systems where at least you can control the location of the data, yet also still quite accessible. Besides data, taking notes is, of course, quite important. And that, again, is something that we have to really get everybody up to speed with, surprisingly. Google Documents is popular, but again, they just stand as a standalone documents. And we found that Atlassian systems work quite well for us, both because of documentations and their project management aspects that can help push these projects forward. Then finally, probably a very important point is the compute resources that previously on the initial
The cyber one must have dropped. So
hello?
yeah, that's about what's out now.
We can still hear you, Andrea.
Okay, yep, thank you. I heard that someone had a question. So the compute resources is, of course, the the simplest thing to do is to work on premises with sensitive or personal data. But this has become unfeasible, as well as with COVID now, this has become very impractical, even in places where this used to be the standard to commute into the place. So the next thing that we thought is practicable for our use cases is to use virtual machines, virtual desktops, again, localized in the availability zones of where the data should be located. And these are manifest in the workspaces themselves. So it does involve, as the field matures and all these tools become more and more available to the practitioners, to us. Thank you. Next, Neil will talk a bit more about the criticality.
The criticality, what a
Go
word.
ahead.
Yeah, no, I think the point you left us on is an important one. You know, despite the fact that, you know, AI machine learning has been around for a few years now, it is still a frontier, as it were. It is still relatively nascent. And so especially for the sort of established and more traditional industries with legacy systems, with distributed assets that need monitoring and at the same time will need protecting, you know, there's work to be done. There's work to be done to build that layer of intelligence on top of them. I mean, just to step back again from the energy context, if you know, our daily lives, from Amazon purchases to Netflix, from recipe recommendations, from the travel planning and route guidance that your devices have, you know, AI is ubiquitous. It's prolific. It is everywhere in our lives, and so the kind of checks and balances that Andras was describing to ensure that, you know, it can't be exploited, that it is free, inherently free of bias, is incredibly important. Especially obviously in sort of mission critical systems, you need to understand the rationale behind a decision that AI would take. Broadly, the sort of the modeling within AI falls into the, you know, the sort of the black box, the hard to explain categories of modeling, you know, broadly referred to as deep learning, as opposed to the more explainable AI, and work's being done to improve the sort of, you know, the opaque lack of explanation for those decisions, which would be critical before you're going to deploy them into, again, into any kind of industry critical solution like the energy sector. I'd just like to finish by saying, you know, at Pivigo we continue to be fascinated by the opportunities there are to utilize AI, from, you know, from essentially the more minuscule tasks of fusing together disparate data sets, and even the asset tagging and understanding your inventory is something where AI can play a part, right through to the, you know, the overarching threat detection, anomaly detection, and protection of the systems. So yeah, we're proud to work alongside EPRI in terms of pushing the envelope of where AI and energy intersect. So yeah, thank you all for your attention.
Yes, thank you, Andras and Neil. I think that's really insightful, and, you know, certainly talking about a couple of different projects that are outside of this industry and even outside of security, I think really gives a good perspective of how important AI has become, especially in those use cases. So certainly things like, you know, mental health and housing availability are extremely important to society. And so, so it's really interesting seeing those, and also I think spurs a lot of thoughts about potentially how some of those learnings and approaches could be leveraged for some of the things that we're thinking about from an energy sector cybersecurity perspective. So definitely thank you both. Are there any questions for Neil or Andres from the group? Hey, go ahead, Jason.
Hey, Jeremy. This is Jason Hollard. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Neil. That was really great and really thought-provoking. And it got my wheels turning while I was in there. So I'm a security guy, right? So I think how can I use some of the things that you've talked about, like computer vision, like AI and machine learning for monitoring to become more to become smarter and help us do our job better for security. When we're using computer vision, I think a lot about camera feeds and how cameras may be used to help us identify sometimes when there may be bad actors at the company or insiders that we may have to try to detect. For example, like if Peter steals Paul's badge and Peter goes to try to use Paul's badge to get into the building, can we use a camera to say, hey, Peter just badged in, but it was Paul's face, right? So that we saw on the camera. So, can we make those correlations using computer vision with AI and machine learning? And maybe can we take them further? Maybe can we say, hey, John's got a lot of frowns today. He might be in a bad mood, or his eyes are darty. He's, he may be trying to do something malicious. Do we have any examples to where we've used those in the past, or been able to apply those to security in the broader sense?
Hi, Jason. Technically speaking, it is possible to analyze facial expressions and get some inference on how might they feel. Of course, you need a balanced data, which there was some precedence to the lack of a balanced data set, so that presents its challenges. But without going into there, of course, what you mentioned, checking a facial scan and badge ID who is associated with that, the challenge there is really about connecting data sets, as Neil started out. You just need to make sure that the face corresponds to the registered name. There are, so artificial intelligence usually starts from the human methods, the human experience. So first you go to automation, and then what it's really good at is recognizing patterns. Patterns typically in very large data sets or complex systems, which is just very hard to have a grasp of as humans. So when you have to see, let's say, 100 different streams of data and catch those correlations, that's almost impossible by eye. But you can give some intuition to the machine where it should look. So analyzing, let's say, behavioral data is possible, and it's in 2 steps. How it's done typically when you first segment out what you see on the screen, convert it into numeric data, and then with numeric data you can talk to computers about it, and those numerical data then can be picked out as patterns. Now, you asked about previous examples, and I'm not sure I can tell you a good example of that, but potentially there are states that utilize these systems currently.
I think the first aspect of what you referred to, Jason, in terms of essentially the anomaly detection, that it's Paul's badge but it's Jason's face, is yes, it's a sort of generalizable approach to anything out of the ordinary, and AI is fantastic. I mean, if you think about the kind of credit card fraud alerts, if your card is suddenly used on the other side of the world, test driving a Lamborghini, hopefully, if you've got a good credit card company, they'll alert you to the fact that's taking place. So anything that doesn't fit within the kind of the routine, and in some cases, this is I'm going back to what Liz was saying at the beginning. You have the noise. It's the signal from the noise. You don't want to have 1,000 alerts because no operator can comprehend that. At the same time, you don't want to have 0 alerts. So it's setting that threshold. It's that kind of degree of unusualness, at which point we should probably get a human operator involved, because ultimately people still have that wonderful intuition as to whether something really is suspicious or not. So the surveillance and the AI can actually work hand in glove, and the AI can do the heavy lifting in terms of the kind of trying to identify the signal. But ultimately, I think, at least for now, and probably for the best, that humans make the call as to whether something is in fact untoward. Your second point on Paul's mood, the sort of the emotion detection with AI is very much at the kind of the cutting edge. I don't believe there are a great deal of sort of deployed, actually running in real time cases, because I think actually discerning people's mood so that you can take actionable steps on the back of it is I think that's very much still in the white paper and research phase, rather than.
If I can jump in quickly, I'm chomping
No, go for it. Yeah.
The Department of Homeland Security actually launched a program a couple of years ago called Avatar for detecting deceitfulness at border crossings. European Union has done it as well, and it's actually really accurate. They're getting about 75% on average, up to 80% detection of deception. And it's exactly what you're talking about. When people are under duress, when they're stressed out because they're lying, they tend to have different facial patterns and things like that. And there are actually really large bodies for these to be trained off of, right? Like faces in the wild and whatnot, not necessarily for video context, but they work really well, and they're being deployed. One of the biggest ones, probably CCP, but they don't tend to publish the results on these kind of things. But they're doing detecting if people are, well, that gets down a whole other rabbit hole. But yeah, it's being done. It's being done quite successfully. So it's something that could actually be implemented. Sorry, I didn't want to just.
Oh, thanks, Aiden.
No. So yeah,
it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, it's a point of incredible importance in terms of entering and leaving different territories. So yeah, it's the perfect place.
Yeah,
to develop that tech. Yeah.
Great to see you again, Jay, by the way.
Thanks, Aiden.
Yeah, these are really great points. I mean, especially as we look at some of the transitions we're seeing in the energy industry, right? So if you think, I can even think back to maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when we really started looking at cybersecurity for nuclear power plants, and one of the first key concepts was, okay, why do we need cybersecurity, right? We've got a fence and we're air gapped, right? Why do we need it, right? And so when we kind of think of that mindset where we are transitioning from a strategy of centralized location that's completely air gapped, fences, and we're going to rely more on gates, guards, and guns. When we look at kind of the future of the energy industry, we're not going to be able to rely on some of those, I think, physical protective measures. So, when we look at just the logistics of putting up a fence around a several thousand-acre wind farm, right? It's challenging, right? And so we're going to need some additional approaches, and I think this could be one of them, where we look at image recognition, video feeds, and analysis of that information, as well as analyzing things like LiDAR. I know is being used in some of those applications as well, but it's a lot different than just having a single centralized generation asset with a fence, right? And so I think that's where some of these things become potentially viable options to help solve some of those challenges. All right. Well, thank you, Neil and Andres. This was excellent presentation and great dialogue and great discussion. So next, what I'm going to do is we'll turn it over to Richard Macklin and Ryan King from the National Renewable Energy Lab, the Department of Energy National Renewable Energy Lab. And so Richard is a senior researcher that works in the Power System Cybersecurity Group. And Ryan is a senior scientist that works in the complex systems simulation and optimization groups within NREL's Computational Science Center. So I'm going to go ahead, and it looks like, Richard, you're able to share your screen. All right, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Can you guys see my screen, hear my voice? That's good.
Yep.
Oh, great. Thanks, Jeremy. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm Richard McMahon. I'm a senior researcher in Power System Cybersecurity Group here. Just to give a caveat, I'm essentially a power engineer by training and education, but I've worked in the field of cybersecurity of power grids for the past few years. So by no stretch of imagination, I am an AI expert per se, but the advantage I have is I have my colleague, Ryan King, essentially, who is an AI expert. So Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ryan. Yep, I'm in NREL's Computational Science Center, and my research is on AI and uncertainty quantification.
Thanks, Ryan. All right. So from our perspective, which is essentially going to be a researcher's perspective, what we are trying to present here is not just what are the cybersecurity challenges of the grid as it exists today, but where do we think as researchers the grid is heading towards? What are the new challenges arising, both from the grid perspective and the cybersecurity of grid perspective? And what are some of the opportunities where AI can help answer some of those challenges and address some of those challenges? Hopefully, this is with an aim that it will help speed some of the use cases that Jeremy and all are looking for at this point. Beyond that, we want to sort of present some concrete AI examples, research examples that we have done here at NRO to help sort of visualize what it makes sense, what it would be to address some of these challenges essentially, and focus on some of the ongoing research and approaches that we think would be very helpful to address some of these future challenges from the energy system perspective. Finally, all of this is essentially dependent on the data that you need and where would you do this kind of assessment. So how we are doing the AI research is basically leveraging our cyber range. So I briefly talk about some aspects of the cyber range and how it can help perform and develop new AI technology essentially, and leave you with some challenges of leveraging AI for cybersecurity in and of itself. So a brief introduction of who we are. We are National Renewable Energy Lab. We are essentially one of the 17 national labs in the DOE umbrella of national labs. However, we are the only national lab with explicit mandate to focus on renewable energy research and future grid, etc. We fall under the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy under the DOE at this point. We are a team of like 2,900 strong researchers. Over the years, we have developed on a number of different fronts, more than like 900 partnerships with industry, academia, government, focusing on varied renewable energy and grid research at this point. We have two main campuses, one located in Golden, Colorado, another a bit north from here, Flatiron, essentially. And both of these are more or less like a living laboratory where we do a lot of energy integration and renewable research. Primary research areas that NREL focuses on is renewable power, sustainable transportation, energy efficiency, including buildings, and policies and energy management programs, etc. The most of the content that we are going to present today falls under the energy system integration, especially on the energy system security and resilience, essentially. So, what we wanted to boot off with here is what do we think are the cybersecurity challenges as the grid is evolving, and where do we think are the AI research opportunities where AI can answer some of these challenges. So looking at some of the features as the grid is evolving. So you can think about with the increasing penetration of distributed energy resources, smart loads, edge devices, increasing penetration of monitoring that we did not have previously in energy infrastructure. How is the grid changes, and what are some of the emerging features of the grid, and what are the cybersecurity challenges it raises? So just briefly going through some of these, the grid is becoming more distributed in terms of its authority. Meaning, if you think about it, initially there were big power plants that were responsible for controlling most of the stability and reliability of the grid. But now with the increasing penetration of DERs, you have more players coming into the realm. And most of these rooftop solar or any of the DER plants, they are essentially contributing to the stability of the grid. So the attack surface from the cybersecurity perspective is getting distributed. Initially, as I think Jeremy mentioned before, it was just power plants or utilities with their air-gapped and physically separated systems. But now that is no longer the case. There are more players in the game than we had before at this point. Similarly, these devices, essentially DERs or edge loads, they are all connected to the internet. So if they are connected to the internet, that provides more entry point for the attackers to come into the system. And this idea of OTID air gap is sort of slowly diminishing. It doesn't really make much of a sense. So an attacker, in order to cause a grid impact, does not need to access a power plant or a utility substation. They can attack multiple DERs or loads and provide an entry point into causing disruption in the system. The other thing that we are noticing is that the controls and the operation of the grid is becoming more and more hierarchical and coordinated. Meaning, before there was this idea that protection is a local control and system stability is a system-wide control happening on a system scale, essentially. But now with the rise of unified protection schemes, protection and control schemes that marries local control with system-level control, you have a very coordinated control and operation of the grid, essentially. So what that opens up is possibilities of cascading failures. So an attack on one location can now have impact throughout the system. And you don't need to access the key. You can only access, the attacker needs to only access some of the key infrastructures and can cause a system-wide impact at this point. The operation is becoming autonomous, both on the physical side of things, such as some of the remedial action schemes in response to a physical event, or special protection schemes. These are all more or less autonomous. And looking at the time scales of operation of the grid, they have to be autonomous because human intervention would not work. And even on the network side of it, a lot of IDS, intrusion detection systems, and intrusion prevention systems are more or less autonomous as well, or they are trying to be autonomous. But how do we trust that the decisions that are being made are correct? You can have a choice of 10 different decisions in response to an attack or an event, but how do you know that you can trust a given autonomous decision? Similarly, the scale of the devices that are getting integrated into the grid are increasing. That basically is expanding the attack surface, which is similar to the distributed nature of the attack surface, essentially. And finally, if you just think about rooftop solars or energy storage or any of these new energy sources that are coming in, they are all having inverter controllers or any kind of communication devices, essentially, from any of the vendors throughout the world. And there is no provenance of either the hardware or the software that is actually controlling some of these devices. So that opens up the risk of supply chain attacks as well onto the grid. So just as we think about where the grid is going with all these changes of happening on the system, these are some of the cyber attack challenges that we are facing right now and will be facing in the future. So going to the next one, where do we think AI can actually help? And in no way these features or the cybersecurity challenges that we are presenting are exhaustive. in any fashion, and nor are any of the AI research opportunities that we are listing. This is more of a food for thought, ideas and approaches to answer some of these challenges. So if we just look at, let's say, distributed attack surface, how can AI help mitigate some of the impacts of this challenge? AI can help with threat correlation. So across different entities and across different geographic areas, and across even domains like IT and OT. Before, we did not have this much of wide or distributed attack surface that we needed to protect, and the view of the system operator wasn't that wide either. And the amount of data that comes out of it is not something that a human perception can immediately sort of call out and detect at this point. So AI can actually help do these kind of threat correlation that, hey, I'm seeing some anomalous behavior on my system at this location, and it is correlated with some sort of a cyber anomaly that I'm seeing on this side of my system. And maybe they are related, maybe they are not. And that's something that AI can actually help detect. Multiple attack entry points, things like hybrid intrusion detection for energy systems. I'll come to this in a bit more detail, where we are leveraging both the traditional cybersecurity approaches from network systems and marrying it with the knowledge of the physics of the system and how it can help essentially come up with intrusion detection because of these varying entry points of attack into the system. Scale of the devices itself, again, AI can help anticipate passing through this large data sets that are generated. A lot of sensing, behind the meter sensing, with VR integration, with smart loads, etc. We have the amount of data and visibility in the grid, but we don't have capabilities to actually make sense of this data. And actually, AI can help us make sense of this data. And hopefully, it will help anticipate some of these emerging attacks or emerging nature of the grid as it's changing because of a cyber anomaly or a physical anomaly at this point. Next, cascading impacts and failures. So again, this is more of a control level problem. How do we develop control systems and security around the control algorithms that control the entire grid? Leveraging physics-informed machine learning, where we marry the knowledge, the physical knowledge of the system with the AI approaches, can help parse out and sort of classify some of these anomalies as to whether it's a physical anomaly that generally happens because of a short circuit or something, or is it because of a cyber attack, essentially. So that's another area where AI can actually help answer some of these challenges. Supply chain, this is kind of a difficult one, but AI can actually help characterize some of the device behavior and maybe generate some sort of trust score across the variety of devices that you have in your system, and how it can actually, how can you create and integrate new technology into the system, and hopefully there is an answer there that AI might be able to help with. And finally, and this one I think is one of the most difficult ones, is the autonomous decision making. Is maybe AI can help with online real-time learning in an adversarial environment. How is the environment changing in presence of an active threat? And maybe an approach that is continuously adapting and continuously learning to what it is seeing in the present system might help answer some of these challenges on autonomous decision making. And hopefully, the decision making algorithms will get better and better as it learns more and more about the system. So again, these are very brief, non-comprehensive, 30,000 feet view of some of the grand challenges that we are seeing and maybe where AI can actually help us. But going to the next one, we want to present two of the concrete research that we have done here at NREL to answer some of these challenges. The first one, as I mentioned before, is the hybrid intrusion detection for energy systems. So what this is essentially, if you think of your control center or a substation, you have intrusion detection happening at different levels, essentially. You can have signature-based, where you have known attack signatures from cyber logs, from previous attacks, or published attacks, etc. And you have models that you can use from the physics of the system itself. For example, generation voltages, marrying that with bus voltages throughout the system, like PMU measurements, etc. And you can come up with rules around, if I see this much deviation on my voltages across the system, there is some sort of anomaly going on. But in this approach, what we are doing is we are marrying both of these together into a learning-based approach. So the outputs of both the signature-based IDS and a model-based IDS is getting into, and we are leveraging a learning algorithm that feeds into this learning algorithm that can help classify the cyber-physical anomalies. So hopefully the approach here is that any anomaly that you see on your system from the control center perspective, is it because of a cyber event or a cyber anomaly, or is it because of a physical anomaly, like a short circuit on your system, etc. So in this work, we did a number of different types of attacks on the ID domain, information technology domain at the utility environment, in sort of an emulated utility environment, and an operational technology environment. The IT attacks were mostly on network scanning, denial of service, and IP spoofing, while the OT level attacks were more malicious stripping of a relay, essentially. So that is something that, from the control center perspective, if a relay is stripped out in the field, you do not know it tripped because there was a fault on the system, or it was a malicious actor who basically caused the tripping. And false attack, where you continuously keep changing either the breaker state or the input going into any of the controllers, or you slowly ramp up for example, the generation set point or something like that on a DER resource. And how can AI help detect any of these kind of attacks? So not going into a lot of the implementation details, the table here represents some of the outputs and the results of how the hybrid intrusion detection, which is based on the learning, the AI learning model, performed as against purely network IDS or model-based IDS. So network IDS was able to detect 100% of network level attacks like IT attacks, while model-based IDS was not able to detect that. But it detected some of the control commands going through the OT layer, essentially. But as you can see, the hybrid level, the hybrid IDS, which is essentially an AI-enhanced learning approach, detected 100% of IT and almost 90 and 97% of both the line falls and the OT level attacks, essentially. So one of the examples of marrying the physics of the system with the network information into a learning-based approach is where AI can sort of outperform currently existing options of detection that we have right now. The second one, the second example I would like to talk about is detection of distributed denial of service attack on an SDN network. Here we basically leverage the well-tuned gradient boosted decision tree algorithm to sort of classify and detect different kinds of denial of service attacks. And we also developed a mitigation strategy using SDN on this particular network. As you can see, for general protocol, meaning not any specific TCP or UDP or HTTP, we were able to detect like a generalized denial of service attack with more than 90%, 97% accuracy on here. So this is another example where, as against traditional approaches that are dependent and tied to some sort of statistical norms around detection, these kind of machine learning approaches can have much better detection of attacks at the network level, essentially. So these are generally the two examples that we have personally worked on in the past. Going on what we are doing right now, and what are the AI research going on at NREL right now, and how do we think we can sort of leverage these approaches for addressing some of the cybersecurity challenges. So the first one that, the first approach that we think would be helpful would be auto encoders for anomaly detection. So auto encoders are essentially these iterative error-based learning approaches where you can feed a good set of training data, and on the other end, it reconstructs the same set of data. And the closer the reconstruction detection, the better is the detection mechanism at this point. So it gives us two basic ideas of basic approaches of detection. One is the distance and the latent space itself. It basically takes down the data into a more lower level form, and then the distance and the latent space can give you some idea of how far or whether the data coming in is anomalous or not, essentially. Endel has used autoencoders to detect physical system anomalies, for example, wind plant flow physics at this point, but the similar approach can be used to do correlation between communication traffic and the physical system anomalies, and hopefully that helps detect some of the cyber anomalies happening in the system. The second one that we think is quite interesting and would be useful to address some of these challenges is reinforcement learning. For what we have used it in past is for distribution system resilience. So in an event of an outage, either because of a physical anomaly or because of a cyber attack, the deep reinforcement learning is able to sort of find the optimal load restoration output that can help restore the system at this point. So the good thing with the deep reinforcement learning approach is the controller is able to sort of restore load despite uncertainty. Uncertainty not in terms of generation, where you have increased number of TERs into your system and your generation is intermittent, but also in terms of unreliable network data or unpredictable user actions, essentially. All of these can be sort of accounted for using the deep reinforcement learning. And these are some of these ties back into some of the challenges that we saw before, essentially. The graph on the right-hand side shows its performance compared to some of the model predictive control approaches that have been used currently. The final one is focusing on the opposite problem, is how can AI help an adversary at this point? And generative adversarial networks is one of the approaches. This is basically a two neural networks essentially training against each other in a competing fashion, where a generator is generating sort of a realistic data set, and the discriminator is able to classify whether the data set that it is getting, is it real or is it fake or generated, essentially. And this kind of approach can be leveraged by and has been leveraged in cybersecurity approaches such as like password cracking, malware, generating new kinds of malware that can feed data into the system. So this has sort of AI defeating AI. So a lot of intrusion detection that is based on AI can essentially, we can see that can be defeated using these kind of approaches, and it's going to get more and more enhanced as we go down the line in the energy system, the cybersecurity perspective. So these are some of the work that we are doing right now, and these are some of the approaches that we are leveraging to answer some of these challenges for the energy system. But how are we doing it? Because all of these are dependent on either the data that you get or the platform on which you can actually assess the efficacy of any of these AI approaches in order to detect any cyber anomalies or cyber attacks on the system. So the first one we have is our cyber range. Enel has a cyber range. There's a platform called Cyber Energy Emulation Platform, which is essentially a hybrid private cloud solution that does cyber physical simulation of the grid. So we have OpenDSS type of solvers, and even we can use real-time solvers into this emulation environment, which then builds up an entire OT infrastructure on top of it. And you can use it as a data generation tool or a platform to assess novel cybersecurity approaches that you can develop using AI. One of the examples of such an environment that we are building right now is a distribution utility scale emulation environment. So think of it as from the control center down to the last relay in the field, including the AMI meters at the load center. So we are creating an emulated environment with multiple SCADA protocols like DNP3, Modbus, GOO 6150, etc., communicating at the OT environment at the substation level and at the control center level, pairing it with the GIS visualization of the entire grid and behind the meter DER resources as well. So the scale, just to give you an idea of the scale of this emulation, is around 375,000 electrical nodes, 134,000 customers, around 20 to 30 different distribution substations, networks. So this is from physical system to the OT environment, reaching right up to the IT environment at the control center level. So, and this is the entire virtual private cloud environment that we have at this point. The next one, we also have a lot of physical resources that we leverage. Our EV and building control test bed, where we have actual chargers and electric vehicles, along with a lot of building control technologies, full-scale wind and solar test bed, a 20 megawatt controllable grid, distribution test management, where we have advanced distribution management systems, etc., that we can leverage, even extreme testing facilities where we can do physical anomalies and gather data on, let's say, wind turbines or solar panels, and use that to develop some of these novel AI approaches to do cyber and physical anomaly detection. And finally, tying it all together is our ARIES research platform at scale, which marries both our campuses, the Golden Campus and the AI campus and the Flatiron campus, and all the physical resources, tying it into the virtual environment. So whether one needs emulated data at a scale, like a distribution utility, which would be very hard to get in real world, or data from a real device, or a marriage of both, we have the facilities to basically support either of those at this point. And that is what we are leveraging to develop some of these novel approaches and algorithms. Finally, I will leave you with some of the challenges that we think AI faces as we use it for developing novel cybersecurity approaches. And this is especially as it pertains to embedded system security. The first is imbalance of data. So even though we can get, let's say, a large amount of operational data from the field, it is sort of imbalanced. There are not many attacks that are happening in the system that you can capture and actually use it for training a lot of these new AI approaches, essentially for cyber attack detection. So how do you account for that? Data pollution. So even if you're getting real-time data, you don't know if it's already polluted, meaning if there's an adversary already present and feeding you fake data, or the data coming out of a substation or a control center is seeing some other anomalies, essentially, which are not malicious anomalies, but they are anomalies nonetheless. Data bias. The availability of data from where you can actually get the data is becoming more and more challenging in a sense. We can get a lot of operational data, but what is needed is essentially this edge data for which we do not have availability. Let's say we create a good AI-based real-time AI-based approach to do cyber attack detection and mitigation, but it needs real-time streaming of data. So how fast can we get the data? What are some of the resource requirements around it? So it's more or less the infrastructure challenge behind even implementing, once we have, let's say, a good AI approach, implementing it in the field is a bigger problem. And finally, defining precise terminologies. So what does it mean that an AI algorithm detected an anomaly? And we need to be able to define it. Is it a probabilistic detection? Is it a deterministic detection? Sometimes it gets muddy. And in order to sort of able to implement these kind of approaches out in the field and increase confidence in these approaches, we need to be able to define these terminologies in a better way. So with that set of challenges, I guess, I will leave you on that. Please feel free to reach out to me if there are any questions or concerns. I can take questions right now, but I will end with that.
All right, thank you, Richard and Ryan. That was extremely insightful. What we'll do now, I think, is I'm going to turn it back over to our next presenter, which is Aiden, just so we can keep on schedule here. We do have a question in the chat box, so I just asked Richard and Ryan if you guys can take a look and monitor the chat. And for the attendees, if you could please just feel free to drop any other questions in chat. We'll address them as they come in.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jeremy.
All right, thank you so much. So next up, we have Aiden Livingston, and Aiden he's the CEO of Thermo AI, and I'll let Aiden talk a little bit about his background here in a second, but Aiden's going to be talking about a project that they've been working on deploying very quickly deployed external sensors to perform not only anomaly detection, but also look at some of the causal evaluations for those anomaly detections. So Aiden, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I'll turn it over to you. And with that, you should be able to control the screen and take it away.
All right. No. Don't feel any pressure about stepping on my toes. You always say it better than I do anyway. So all my good one-liners are from talking to you and Jason. So please, and I mean, that's open to anybody. Feel free to jump in. I feed off an audience. So I am Aiden Livingston. I am the founder and CEO of Thermo AI. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've exited about 4 different companies, contributor to VentureBeat's AI section, twice published author. And while I was working on a previous startup, I was down in South America and I happened across a young chemical engineer called Carolina Chavez, who informed me about set point operations in combustion settings. And that, generally these things were just done on global averages, which blew my mind. And created a lot more pollution and really killed efficiency. I thought that was a great problem. I'm sure, as the guys earlier can attest, that's a really good machine learning problem. When there's a lot of data points, it's very complicated, it's multifaceted, but there's an exact answer to how close you got to perfect efficiency. I pitched the idea to a CTO who I've worked with before, David Watson, who's a PhD in machine learning out of Oxford University. He agreed it was a good opportunity, and we started Thermo AI. So we first started and we got into Startup Chile, which is the government program in Santiago de Chile. And there we started working with some actual utilities who gave us data, because at this point it was pretty much just a hunch that I had that AI could actually do a better job. We got actual operational data, and we were able to see that, yeah, there was huge rooms for improvement, increasing overall thermal efficiency. At that point, we got into Techstars' first ever AI program in Montreal, and that connected us with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all the AI experts who helped us further develop our models and build it out. And then just this year, we were the $1 million Clean Energy Prize winners from NYSERDA. So we're in the process of moving back to New York State. And we also got funded by the National Science Foundation to do work with Washington University to run trials on real equipment to prove out our solution. And then so to tell you a little more about what that is specifically, because it's also a very interesting use case for AI. So like I was saying, right, is, at the end of the day, combustion is a chemical reaction, right? Everything from the weather outside, the humidity, the state of the equipment, the quality of the fuel, all change the exact chemical reaction, right? And right now that is almost impossible for a human operator to do, right? But we take kind of the same approach that you would do in like a time series analysis and figuring out causal modeling. So moment to moment, basically predicting inefficiencies that are coming down the pike and changing ahead of time. And that's how we're able to increase efficiency in these systems. And as you can see in these simulators, I mean, this is amazing. It's like, 0.98. That's perfect within the margin of error is what we're seeing on this. And really the whole world is going in this way, right? We're seeing more and more of this, that a lot of these tasks are going to start being automated. People don't want to be there. There's high turnover rate in operators anyways. And that kind of put an idea in the back of my mind, as well as when we were talking to individuals and they said, well, what are you guys going to do to protect us against cybersecurity? Because you're directly connected to our controls. It's like, well, that's a good question. And so the entrepreneur in me was like, I don't know, let me go figure that out. And so I started going down the rabbit hole and realized, I mean, some of the things that's been brought up on this call, not only were we going to be the biggest cyber threat, I mean, everything was already, right? These were meant to be air gap systems, and that IoT explosion means that there is a ton of vulnerabilities without even getting into the supply chain vulnerabilities and the third party cloud process. I mean, there's so many different entry points that, there's a great book by Eric Cole, Cyber Crisis, that I recommend everybody interested in this check out. And he said, like, at the end of the day, he says to every new client is like, you're going to get shot. You get to pick. Do you want to get shot in the leg or do you want to get shot in the chest? And I mean, really, that's the reality that we saw, is that, cyber attacks are going to happen, especially on OT. There's just not as much protection there. It is impossible. If there is a team of 30 talented developers looking into it, they're going to find a vulnerability, and they only have to find one, right? And the other thing that really made that more clear as we were looking into all of this is prevention is ideal. Detection is a must. At the end of the day, there's got to be some type of attack. You need to be able to detect that and mitigate the effects of it immediately. And that's what we started focusing on. So fortunately, we realized that the same digital twin simulating solutions that we had developed for our combustion optimization could be used. And I mean, this gets into a lot of things that the previous presenters were talking about with random forest and gradient boosted trees and all that. The same kind of underpinning could be used for detecting anomalous behavior, what's outside of perfect. And the basic idea that we've come up with was that adding a separate system, separate sensors totally remote from the current control system, a system watching the system, and then monitoring the physics of the system like they were talking about, and comparing that to the signal in the current control system. And what can we develop that would be totally separate so that it is not, because I mean, currently, if you're with the current control systems, if one thing gets hacked, all the things are suspect. You can have a replay attack where they play back old sensor data showing that everything was still good, right? Hold on one second. Can you open this again? I have my notes here on the my co-founder's computer, and that closed down, so I need to make sure I have my script going. But basically what we realized is that by turning that around and then bringing in separate sensor data, we could compare different sensing feeds, right? So vibration, temperature, sounds, amps going into a system, and that we thought that would actually probably be pretty accurate feed to determine if any type of intrusion was going on the OT system, and that could be added quickly, that could be added just with magnets in a day, and then hopefully that would accurately predict, or rather detect, any intrusions on the cyber physical system. So that was the idea that we pitched to EPRI, and they agreed it was an interesting use case. So then we got to go test out the idea at the lab over in Charlotte. So we worked with Jeremy, we worked with Jason, Paul, we were all great. And I mean, the results were just fantastic. With some of the models, it was 100% accuracy. Other ones were 99.99%. It was so accurate, in fact, let me just go to this next one, because this just blows my mind from a data science perspective. Not only could we detect that there was an attack, this is the thing that got brought up earlier, we could detect what type of attack, right? So sometimes it's just bad visibility, an operator error. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily a cyber attack, so that shouldn't throw the same kind of alarm as something that is an actual cyber attack. And we were able to detect with 100% accuracy what type of attack was actually going on. Is this a low level? Is this a bad configuration, an operator error, or a potential harmful cyber attack? Because all of those should elicit a different type of response. So the next step is actually, and this is the other thing that got brought up by one of the other presenters, is we want to build out a library of all different types of anomalies, right? We only worked for a couple of days. So now we're looking at doing a further project with the digital demonstration facility in Alabama, so that we can have a permanent installation of these sensors there and really start building out the body of our knowledge and understanding of what normal operation and abnormal operation, and actually start labeling that. And that would have broad implications in that this could just be a couple sensors that could be added by the current technicians that are there on site, and that would immediately start bringing a good cross-check reference to the signal in the system, and being able to, like I said, you can't prevent everything, but being able to immediately detect it and mitigate the harmful effects, I think is the real opportunity that we are seeing here. And some of the benefits also being able to detect the false positives. We see that even with clients. Sometimes you can't trust the signal in the system because it's a malfunctioning sensor or something, and it's not necessarily an attack, it's just something wrong within the current control system. Us being able to cross-reference once again against the physical environment and detect the severity of anything and rule out those too many false positives so that people can focus on the things that are real, so they don't just shut off the alarms. And then once again, expanded visibility. These are very inexpensive sensors. They're done wirelessly through a LoRa network. so that it can be easily installed and very cheaply into any of these systems, and that we can actually see things like drains, right? This could be a malicious insider that right now there are no sensors on. These are all the things that we can get in front of and we see as real exciting opportunity. I know we don't have a ton of time, so maybe I can turn it over to questions.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Aiden. And I mean, you really hit on a good point, right? Really talking about the need for a really holistic defense and depth approach, right? So really looking at cybersecurity from the protection perspective, the detection, and then also response and recovery. And so I know a lot of the things we've talked about were specific to detection, but I think one of the things that AI potentially could bring into play is really bringing to the forefront enabling automated response. I think that to me is almost I know Liz was talking about the challenges and maybe the holy grail being something, an automated solution for inventory. But I think, one of the other, to me at least, holy grails could be enabling automated response. And I think one of the challenges that I see is that with the existing detection capabilities that we have a lot of false positives, right? And that's just the fact of the matter. And if we take automated actions on a false positive, you could run the risk of obviously the cure being worse than any potential cyber attack. So if you're always tripping a plant offline, if you're always isolating a portion of the grid, every time you have some kind of anomaly that may not even be malicious, then you run the risk of having a detrimental effect and it being worse than what you're trying to prevent or minimize in the first place. And so I think really it's important to think about that kind of layered approach as well. And, I think it's also important, you talked a little bit about the classifications of the different anomalies. And so when we look at these different anomalies, we have good information and we've got a lot of background and experience on anomaly detection. We have a lot of experience with things like condition-based monitoring and maintenance as well. So we do have some historical information, but a lot of times on the physical side with OT systems, the plant systems that those systems, OT systems are trying to control, we could have just typical mechanical failures, right? They happen. So I think getting into the causality and the classification is a really important step and potentially a good opportunity to bring in the additional information from the network layers and the normal security types of traffic information that we typically see, and combining that with the physical anomaly detection that you're looking at.
Exactly. Like I said, Jeremy, you always say it better than me. I gotta write down your points because I mean it's exactly right, and really that feeds into what Cheryl had even just asked about. What is the purpose of a digital twin? Exactly that, right? It's like you can't necessarily do rules based on everything. That it's like if it exceeds this, because it's like they run in different operation settings, right? So having a full simulation of what normal operation looks like gives us the baseline to build from. Right, of like understanding it's like, okay, well, this has been seen in the base of normal operation versus this is not how that pump is supposed to be acting right now. Something is wrong, kind of thing, be it from an operator error or some visibility thing. And I think we have another question here too. Is Richard? Oh yeah, just saying about it. Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. It's very interesting. It's something we're very excited to be working with Jeremy and Jason on in going into the next steps, because there really is, like, the more and more we're digging into it, it's like this is a huge opportunity. I mean, frankly, the accuracy that we're getting from these models is incredible from machine learning. I mean, generally, like Google and things like that get up to 80% R squared. 0.99 is just unheard of. So it's an exciting opportunity.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Aiden. Yeah, and we're really looking forward to this. I mean, just to clarify real quick on this project. So we haven't, this is a project that we've conceptualized taking to the demonstration level. So we are hopeful we're able to get some real runtime in a power plant, but we'll have to see how this all progresses as well. So so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the wrap up feel free. We've got about 10 minutes left. I see some couple questions in chat. It looks like we've gotten to all those. Feel free to drop any more questions in chat that you might have. We'd be happy to take those. Also, if you want, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand. We can take you off mute. You can ask your question verbally as well. So we've had, and keep the questions coming. I'll just kind of get into this a little bit, and as we talk about really next steps to this. So really when we heard from Jeremy Renshaw and the speakers this afternoon about really how we got to this point of identifying 5 grand challenges that really represent great opportunity for artificial intelligence-based solutions to help close some of the gaps that exist in industry. And so really, I kind of see this this session as one of the launching points for ongoing collaboration and continued research in these different areas. And so I'm really excited about that. And so what I would ask is if anybody is interested, we definitely have everybody's information from the sessions today, but feel free to reach out to myself either directly or contact us at ai@epri.com. And really what we're envisioning is that we're going to be managing this as a community of interest. So this is something that would be ongoing, that would be really open to individuals from utilities, ranging from utilities to universities, to national laboratories, to technology startups, technology providers, DCS providers, major technology providers, and everybody in between. And so we've already really started to reach out, and we've had a lot of great discussions building this interest around this community of interest. And what we'd like to do is hold bi-monthly webinars to be able to share experiences, right? So share discussions about some of the different use cases that people are looking into, hopefully identifying if there are some challenges to implementing those, taking them from the lower technical readiness reviews up to the higher, TRL levels, down to up to, I should say, going through proof of concept stage, going from conceptual to proof of concept to demonstration, and ultimately, depending on the use cases, making them commercially available to the public. And so really that's what we're trying to foster, is that sharing and collaboration. And so I would envision during these different webinars, we'd be able to not only share these use cases, but talk about the needs for the different data sets as well. I think data sets is a challenge, especially when we start looking at the cybersecurity domain and applying AI-based approaches, because like Liz mentioned, there's just a lot of challenges with sharing information, especially with some of the regulatory requirements here in the States, but I think also across the world. Also, just by the very nature of cyber events, right? People don't necessarily want to share what I would call the interesting cyber data, right? So if you have, heaven forbid, a cyber attack at a power system, that would be something that people may not want to share. And so that's one of the challenges. And I think that's where some of the approaches like Ryan and Richard mentioned with utilizing lab capabilities to generate data sets that we could use then to develop the AI models could really come into play. And so that's one of the things I think we could look at as well as part of this community of interest. And then, of course, just sharing lessons learned in different technologies, right? And so I think that would be really key. And so if maybe we haven't addressed certain things in the energy sector, but we might be able to leverage learnings from the medical industry, from the manufacturing industry, from other industries that might be a little bit further along in the AI space, that could be a huge benefit to us as well. And so that's one of the other goals and focuses of this community of interest. And then last but not least, I think it would be great that we'd be able to, if we were able to identify potential demonstrations. So if we have things that have gone from the lower TRL levels that have gone through conceptual phases and then proof of concepts, and they're ready for field demonstrations, that could be a great opportunity to collaborate as well. So I'm really looking forward to this. Definitely be on the lookout for future communications as we plan to start launching these bi-monthly webinars. We've already started to have discussions with some different universities who have some really cool projects that really are excited about sharing some of those projects. I think those will be some of the first webinars that we hold. But then if anybody has any interest in sharing their projects, we can certainly talk about that as well. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody, especially all of our presenters today. I'd like to thank everybody that attended. We had some good feedback, great dialogue in the chat box. And it was really, I think, beneficial to this effort going forward. So I do want to thank everybody today, and have a great rest of your day. All right, take care, everyone.